what has been a hypersonic revolution that has brought us to the era of the space shuttle and promises for the future even potentially greater advancements in the area of hypersonic flight. Now, as I said, time is of the essence here, and so unfortunately, we're going to limit each of our speakers to 6 minutes, and I'm going to have to pull the plug at that point. I thought what we'd do is we'd start by basically working through this in roughly chronological sequence in terms of their involvement in the program. And so I'd like to start with Scott Crossfield, an SCTP fellow, an individual who 50 years ago this year made the first Mach II flight, to talk to us about his most memorable recollections in the contractor flight testing on the X-15. Scott?
Well, thank you, Dick. It has to be mentioned that never under one roof has ever been gathered so much documentation of imminent disaster for the taxpayers' budget. The X-15 was not that kind of an airplane. It had its troubles, but it had a lot of good things about it. It was one of the best airplanes we ever had in the research stable, and I claim it was because a pilot had a lot to do with designing the airplane. It made a record on the first flight. It was no powered. It was a glide flight, and the Southern California Soaring Society gave me a beautiful streamlined brick trophy for having a world's record for the shortest time from 38,000 feet to the ground. 3 minutes and 58 seconds. That was my checkout flight, which consisted of getting it flying. It handled well. It had handling qualities weren't too bad. I did a few flap down operations and then landed. Had what looked to me all like all the world, a static instability on landing, which turned out later to be a control system problem. It made a record on the second flight, which was a powered flight with the old LR-11 engines that were used, 2 of the clusters that were used on the other rocket airplanes, and we made Mach 2 on the first flight. From then on, the airplane began to come together, except it and I were at a Mexican standoff. It was going to kill me, and I was going to break that bronc. I won, and it turned out to be one of the best research airplanes we ever had in the stable. Now, I could go on for 5 hours about stories about it, but the people who really did the work on the X-15 are sitting over here, and I'm going to yield to them.
Well, thanks that's admirable brevity, Scott. Thank you very much.
What came over you?
I'm astonished. We'll move, it must be all those experiences with the right replica. We'll move right along to Major General Bob White, SCTP member, former AFFTC Center Commander. General White, you were one of the very first to really routinely explore the hypersonic regime with the X-15. What were the challenges you faced? What did you learn out of that process as you were really taking us into a new frontier of flight?
I'd like to preface that with a little remark first about the appearance of Chuck Yeager the day before yesterday. It was a great comedy routine, the best I've seen in years, but there were some objections to the fact that he seemed to give the NACA a hard time. I'd like to put a different spin on it and say that I think he was right, because in those days, we were operating in 2 universes, and they just couldn't seem to come together. Perhaps he focused attention on that, and that resulted in the fact that the X-15 program, right from its very beginning, was cohesive with people from the different agencies and would work like a charm. I made good friends with all of the people here in this group and many more in NASA, and so the record is straight on that. I only flew with Chuck twice. The first time was just a short trip back and forth to Vegas. I was in the back seat of the F-100. And he asked me, Bob, I'd like to fly in the 104 with you and see how the dead stick pattern goes. I said, okay, that happened. Stuffed him in the back seat, and I went ahead and started a high key, configured to get the right L over D. And we were going around, and I was calling out all the checkpoints and the visuals and so forth. And then finally, on final approach, came down where you break the glide to kill off your descent rate. Full flaps come down, coasting along. And Chuck said, Bob, when the hell are you going to put the gear down? Well, of course, I said, Chuck, about now. And that was the way we did it. Okay. Beyond that, I've had some concern in looking at the program. I had no problem in the beginning. I was with dedicated people, and I give Bob Hoy and Dick Day, U.S. Air Force and NASA engineers, and I had as much faith in them as Chuck Yeager did in Jack Ridley. So I give them kudos for that. But the intensity of the work proved to minimize the problems you'd expect in flight. In fact, it was a good airplane, basically, so that was no difficulty. But in following it from afar, when I left the program, I began to wonder, are we losing our focus? We're starting to put a bunch of experiments on the airplane. By the time they were doing all this stuff, the flight envelope had been completely inspected. We had all the answers there, all we could get. And we did lose one aircraft. And that's why that was the focus of my concern. I wrote a letter to Bob Rushworth. I was in Thailand just finishing a combat tour, and he answered me. And he started off by explaining that they had this experiment, and the pilot was going up to somewhere over 250,000 feet. But in the course of that, he said they mechanized the display so the vertical needle on your attitude indicator could be mechanized to have two functions. Position one, you measure the side slip to keep the side slip down. Position two, you're going to see the deviation and roll angle. And some technique they were going to use in this position was to rock the wings, because the experiment on the right wing, I think, was out there to measure solar radiation, and they were going to look at the radiation above the horizon and below the horizon. Well, before he got to that point, he did switch to that roll indication, and he started getting electrical noise. Okay, the electrical noise had a deleterious effect upon the flight control system. In fact, one time the flight control augmentation system dropped offline. He did reset it, but it caused further problems because he was trying to correct his deviation in yaw, but he actually was playing around with this indication that shows roll control, roll displacement. So that started to confuse the issue. The right-hand control stick had integrated both the aerodynamic controls and the reaction controls. And the reaction controls cut in automatically when you reached a certain low level of dynamic pressure. Well, he wasn't getting the responses he wanted, so he went to another control, which was for the thruster systems, and that you could use that at any time. And he was working this, and still there was great confusion. Now, what happened, and I didn't envy Pete. He was the voice of NASA One down in the control room, and it appears to you that you're still on the arc, even though you're away from that. Your flight path will remain the same. It's a ballistic trajectory, so if I go out of the atmosphere on 270 degrees, I ought to be coming into the atmosphere at 270. Well, he was getting off in yaw, and at one time it reached 90 degrees. He was sideways. Now, why didn't Pete call him and tell him this? Well, another problem. They didn't have any indication of aircraft heading in the control room. And we know the result. He re-entered. He was off at an angle. The airplane was thrown out of control, and a tragedy in itself. I did query someone not so long ago about the lack of intensity, perhaps. And he said, yeah. He said, we were so covered with all these requests for experiments that perhaps it did take away the intensity we had in the program. Having said all that, when I finished the program, I was really a protagonist for another research airplane, And I hope that before my day to go west would come, I would see that airplane fly. Well, it's not going to happen. God knows when it might. So unless you have another question, I'll tell you that I've enjoyed this visit, and I have only one serious regret during this occasion. I found out that as a resident of Florida, I cannot run for governor of the state of California.
Well,
Very good.
well, our next speaker could run for governor of California. For some reason, I'm very surprised he hasn't, and that's Pete Knight. So I think he's the only person in the state who hasn't. Pete, it fell to Pete to take the X-15 to the greatest performance that it experienced in terms of Mach number, out to Mach 6.70. Pete, you were flying a modified variant of the number 2 airplane, the so-called X-15A2. Tell us a little bit about the problems that you had on that flight and how you approached it.
Well, I didn't know I had problems on that flight, first of all, that you're telling me. But anyway, I want to answer Bob's question, you know, who wants to be governor of the state in this in its position? You know, it's financially broke. And I didn't want to take over. And I didn't have $3,500.
He was afraid he'd be mistaken for Gary Coleman.
I forgot to make the ground rule. No short jokes. In any event, number 2 was a modified X-15. After an accident, we rebuilt the airplane. We extended it about 29 inches to allow for a volume to carry a fuel for a little scramjet we were going to mount on the lower ventral of the airplane. And that was the whole idea of going faster. We needed to get out to about Mach 8 in order to provide an envelope for that little scramjet to operate in. And it was a dummy, but it was instrumented with pressure and temperature all around it, so we could give that data to the engine developer. In order to go faster, we needed more fuel, so we added the 2 external tanks. One carried the fuel, one carried the oxidizer, and interestingly, those tanks did not weigh the same. There was 2,000 pounds difference between those tanks. So you can imagine the airplane was asymmetric to start off with. In fact, on launch, it took full right-hand control to keep the airplane level. And then as the tank fuels burned out, you could come off of the right control. Now we're going to go faster. Now we're going to be in a high heat regime for a longer period of time. So we're going to have to cool the airplane or keep it from getting hot. So we'll put an ablative material on it. And what we did was we glued on a molded leading edges and then sprayed the material up to thickness to cover the entire airplane. First thing we found out was that material, if in the presence of locks and it got into a valve and the valve closed, it would detonate. Wasn't acceptable in the fuel system to have a detonation. So we put numerous filters all around the system, and then as you looked at this material, it was kind of like a pencil eraser, and it would rub off. And besides that, it was pink, and I wasn't going to fly a pink airplane. So we painted it white, gave it a little structural integrity, and then we found out that as this material begins to ablate, char, or whatever it does, it comes back and it sticks to the window, makes the windows opaque, and we'd already cut the visibility down so much that we couldn't go any farther. So I said, no, hold it. I got to be able to see out of this thing. If you remember, the original X-15 had rectangular windows. Bob took care of that. He busted all the windows out, and so we went to oval windows, getting rid of the corners in the airplane. So we said, okay, what we'll do is we'll put an eyelid on the left window, and you can use the right window at launch and during the acceleration phase, and then when we get to the ablative material coming back and sticking to the window and you can't see out, and we decelerate down below Mach 3 or so, you can open the left window, look outside, hope the lake bed's on the left, make a left pattern, and land. And so that's what we did. We checked that out first by putting a blind in the airplane so that in the event we couldn't land or we couldn't see well enough, we could open it up. And so that worked out all right. The tendency was to yaw the airplane so you could see, but you got over that. Anyway, so now we can go faster, and now we can protect the airplane. And so we were in a process of a build-up flight program. They're going to go to a little over 6, 6.5, 7, 7.5, and 8. And I had made one flight to 6.33. Everything was okay. We put the ablative material on. I went to 6.7. Came back and landed, and during the approach, you normally jettison the remaining fuel so that the chase pilot can see you and join up easy. And so I went to jettison. They didn't see anything, and in fact, I didn't jettison. So came down and final flared, put the flaps down. The flaps didn't come down. I was heavy. Fortunately, I got it on the ground all right. Came to a stop, and as you land the X-15 and you roll to a stop on a lake bed, there's a whole host of vehicles, an entourage of people and vehicles come to meet you, and they all go to the front of the cockpit and help you out. Well, this time they all went to the back of the cockpit, and nobody was up front. Now I'm sitting there, and they're not getting me out. I said, something's wrong. So finally one guy came up with a stepladder, and he got me out by himself. And I walked back there, and sure enough, we had burnt the airplane pretty bad. The ablative material that we had put on the lower ventral was not molded, and it was not the same as the leading edge. We had troweled on that material. And as a result of the shockwave interference of the scramjet and the airplane, it got through that material, and once it got through and took all the material off, it got into the lower ventral. And it was like you took a blowtorch in there. And that stuff melts at about 2,800 degrees, so it got a little warm down there. And it had cut the jettison lines, so I couldn't jettison. And got into the flap motors as well. Flaps didn't come down. So anyway, it was a successful flight as far as we knew, and we figured out what the problem was, and we could have rebuilt it, put more stuff on it, and I think made a successful approach out of it.
And that airplane today is in the collections of the Air Force Museum. It never flew after that flight, although it was restored to flight status.
It was rebuilt, and it is in the Air Force Museum at Great Pat.
We have two individuals here who had interesting shared experiences between the X-15 and later programs. We have Bill Dana, who was involved in the X-15 and the lifting body program, and then we have Joe Engle, who had the experience of flying the X-15 and then flying the shuttle itself. So I'd like to go from Bill then to Joe. Bill, you were a NASA research pilot. You had a long experience in flight test and flight research. And you had the opportunity to see this transition in two kinds of hypersonic vehicles. What struck you as interesting from your recollections of the 15 program and the lifting body program?
Well, certainly with the X-15, it was the accelerations you felt. When you lit the engine, you had about 2 Gs chest to back, and as the fuel burned out, that increased to almost 4 Gs chest to back. On the altitude flights, why the engine quitting was a big relief because you were at 0 atmosphere. The flights down in the atmosphere, like Pete's heating flight, why you went from a big chest to back acceleration to a back to chest acceleration as the engine burned out at high dynamic pressure, and tears would form on the lenses of your eyes and then break off and go shooting up and hit the back of your faceplate. And I think I enjoyed the heating flights more than the altitude flights because you were in control of your flight path at all times, whereas on the altitude flights you could control the aircraft attitude, but there was no atmosphere to allow you to control your flight path. The lifting bodies were lesser performance vehicles. They had an X1 engine in them, an engine that the X-1 had flown with called the LR-11. It put out about 8,000 pounds of thrust as equipped for the lifting bodies, and that gave you performance vaguely comparable to an F-104 aircraft. The lifting bodies flew to 90,000 feet and to almost Mach 2, but their performance wasn't anything compared to the X-15.
Joe, you had the unique experience then of eventually fulfilling the hypersonic promise of actually flying a hypersonic reentry from space, and that you had the whole background of experience that you had done with the X-15, including significant flights to altitude with it. How did you find that X-15 background in terms of the work you later did with NASA and getting ready for and then executing some of the very first shuttle flights?
Well, well, of course, it was obvious from a personal standpoint, but I think probably the really important thing for all of us is that to understand how much influence the X-15 and the program itself had on the development of the space shuttle, particularly the early development of the space shuttle. Johnny Armstrong helped me out with one of these presentations not too long ago, and it vividly pointed out how similar and how big a stepping stone the X-15 gave us in the development of the X-15. You look at them, the two had unpowered landings. We used unpowered landings. Both had lift-to-drag ratio within 0.2 of a point of each other, 4.5, 4.7. So they were relatively low L/D ratios. The things that we learned, they both had an outer glide slope. If you flew either one of them at 295 to 300 knots, you were right in the window. You'd flare, put down the gear, touch down at or just under 200 knots. Both the X-15 and the space shuttle. So the two of them were very, very closely related from a performance standpoint, and also from a procedural and a piloting standpoint as well. The energy management that we used on the X-15 to set up from Mach whatever 3 or whenever you finished your data points to visually go out the window to set up the overhead pattern, identical to that used on the space shuttle. Now, all of the techniques that we used were the same, so it gave us a gigantic step of confidence, and I think allowed us to proceed with the development and the early flight testing of the space shuttle that we would not have enjoyed had we not had the X-15 program. In fact, it allowed us to put that culture of people who said you had to have some kind of power augmentation with an airplane with that low of an L/D to make sure that you could land it at the right spot. The idea of having to put air-breathing engines or having to put a rocket-augmented engine on the space shuttle for that final touchdown to make sure you made it to the bridge. We're able to point to the record and the performance of the X-15 and avoid that ugly air-breathing engine on the outside, and you could come in and land. So to me, that was probably for all of us in the room is one of the things that we all kind of hope for, and that is to be part of a program that directly influences and directly enhances and allows another program to move forward more rapidly. The transition from exo-atmospheric, from above the atmosphere and flying only on reaction controls, the transition during the entry to landing, exactly the same technique that we used on the X-15. It was a more elongated entry. It took a lot longer, but basically the same thing. And from a personal standpoint, yeah, I really feel lucky to have gotten to be in on both programs. I think it was Dave Hartman told me, you're damn near too young to fly the X-15, damn near too old to fly the shuttle, but it happened anyway. Yeah, Yeager was not quite so sensitive. He said, yeah, Shay, you just crawled under the covers in time for the X-15 and you got into the shuttle before they kicked you out of bed. And that's something we all can relate to, and I'll tell you, everything underneath those covers was absolutely great, and I wouldn't trade it for any other career in the world either.
That's great. That's excellent. That's excellent. That we had a lifting body program was due to our next speaker in very large measure. There were various approaches people had taken to tailoring blunt body reentry shapes and seeing if they could generate lift and then possibly generate some sort of controllable vehicles for reentry from space. There were approaches taken by James Love at Langley. You had Clarence Sivertson and some people working in this area at Ames coming up with modified half cones. And you had a model builder by hobby and also an engineer working at the Dryden Flight Research Center, then called the NASA Flight Research Center, Dale Reed, next speaker, who decided to experiment with these, and he made some interesting flying models and then decided to go out and get together with Paul Bickle and actually convince Bickle to approach Gus Breglib and make the first wooden lifting body, the M2F1. And Dale, if you wouldn't tell us a little bit about that story and then how that got NASA interested in going the whole way toward a rocket-propelled demonstrator.
Okay, I was making the observation that this is the year that we're celebrating the 100th anniversary of the Wright's first flight. And I got to thinking, well, this is the 40th year of the first wingless flight, this August. And so I got to think a little bit further, how similar was our program on this first vehicle to what the Wright did. And I come up with about 12 different items. And first of all, the situation was that the lifting body was basically an idea with at the other centers. I had some colleagues there, Al Eggers and Jim Love and Hansel Molthop with the Air Force was kind of the leading person there. But the distinguished engineers were very skeptical. It was very much like the first flight, and very skeptical of flying with lifting bodies. And in fact, Paul Bickle's right-hand charge of research went on record that it was he felt that the research value of flying a lifting body was not worth the risking a pilot's life. And but anyway, I was able to convince Milt Thompson, who was an X-15 pilot with these fellows here, and Milt asked him if I was able to design and build one of these things, would he fly it? And he said, sure. Milt would fly anything. I mean, he flew crop dusters, and he flew this crazy-looking Parasev Regala wing thing, right along with the X-15, this famous X-15 airplane. So he was a logical guy. So he and I went to Paul Bickle and got sponsorship from him. But we could not have sold this to NASA headquarters with the real negative feeling there was among the managers. So Paul Bickle basically sponsored us with his coffee fund, but it only cost us $30,000 to build this mock-up, you might say, a flying mock-up. If you could show the first, you can show my first view graph there. Yeah, this is a poster I used to sell my book, Wingless Flight. And I have several lifting bodies. I'm sitting in the cockpit of this flying mock-up. Well, it turns out that Paul Bickle went ahead. I feel he's one of my aerospace heroes. I feel he rates right up there with, in my personal opinion, with Kelly Johnson and Von Braun, even though he's not as well known in the aerospace community. But I think he's, when you really look what he accomplished and how so forth. So this whole program was an evolution. We started out with this little mock-up, and we didn't intend to go any further with that other than just showing. So our whole motivation was very similar to the Wrights. The Wrights were motivated by fun, I think, to build that, and the challenge of flying first. They became businessmen much later on, and I think that's where they lost their ingenuity later on. But we were motivated. We had a group out there at Dryden that built home-built airplanes, and Paul Bickle let me put together 4 engineers and 5 technicians, and we went over in the corner and put a curtain up over there because he didn't want this to be really known too much. Some of the guys were so motivated they put Wright Bicycle Shop on there, and because we felt so much like the Wrights at the time. 4 months later, we had the airplane on its wheels. the guys were so motivated to build this. Paul Bickle would come by once a day, even though we were still flying the X-15s, which is a major program there. He'd come by, and that motivated the guys so much that they wouldn't stop working, and they wanted to work all the time. And we had that thing on its wheels in 4 months. Now, another thing that was very similar to the Wright brothers, that we built part of the airplane in a shed, very similar to the shed in a remote site, very similar to what the Wright brothers had at Kitty Hawk. It was out at El Mirage. We built the wooden out there. And then the other item was our first flight was, we solved our stability roll problem at 3 feet above the ground with a car tow. If we'd have flown any higher, Milt would have flipped upside down, and we changed the control system from rudders, using vertical rudders, to elevons. And it was bouncing from wheel to wheel, and Milt insisted it was a landing gear problem, but he wasn't moving the landing gear or moving the controls. But we had movies to prove otherwise, and we re-rigged the controls and solved it and went on to the airplane tow. So there was a lot of events there that we felt was very similar, and before we moved on to the heavy weightlifting bodies.
Dale has written a very fine book on this, on the history of the lifting bodies, and I commend it to the audience. Also, Curtis Peebles' Flight Without Wings, because it is full of absolutely remarkable stories. There's some people here we do need to recognize. You've mentioned Milt Thompson. Bruce Peterson is certainly another one. Bill, for his early work in the lifting body program. And I think also we must remember Jerry Gentry, who actually at one point did a roll on the end of a tow line behind a behind a C-47. So getting these things straightened out was a rather difficult business. Now, Major General Cease Powell here was one of the most distinguished of the lifting body pilots. His experience was with the X-24, largely with the X-24, and also the M2, I believe. And he would like to give us a little presentation on what it was like to prepare for those flights.
Well, that's kind of you to refer to me as distinguished, but I have to tell you, I was a very junior member of a team largely made up of many of the folks sitting here, a still perhaps to declare candidate for governor. The dean of lifting body flight, Joe, had just left. And so I started to say the youngest member, but I realized that in this assemblage, one of us using the term youngest is being absurdly relative in use of the term. Nevertheless, I got my first opportunity to fly in a captive flight, unpowered, and I realized probably a few hours after landing that I needed to do something a little bit more than I was doing at that point to try to get ready for subsequent flights. This is really a vignette for those of you who still have very dark hair, thinking about your future, and I'm not sure there's a moral in this story. In any case, there were really two components to preparing for the flight. One of them was the landing portion, which of course you simulated with the 104, and I had actually started my training without knowing it by playing Chase 4 for both Bill Dana and Pete Knight in their landing of the X-15. The other component was in a simulator, engineering simulator, I think it was euphemistically called, where you could see the aspects, the aerodynamic parameters that you're going to try to meet. You could do a pitch doublet, you could do a rudder pulse, but it was very rudimentary. No similarity to the cockpit in toto. Well, after that first flight, I decided that if I was going to be mentally prepared for a mission, a test mission that went from 45,000 to 90 plus back to the Earth in less time than Ken Dyson was in that parachute coming down from his experience, that I'd better do something else. And so what I personally did was simply go down to the NASA facility before every flight, probably anywhere from 2:30 to 4 in the morning, and I just sat in one of the birds, flew the mission over and over and over in my head, touched all the switches, and that was the only way that I felt like I could successfully integrate for a flight that lasted 7 minutes plus nominally. It was a great experience, and I realize as I've listened to all the presentations here today that since that 100th or that 100-year-ago event that we're commemorating, that we're building a gigantic mosaic, and I'm just thankful I had a chance to maybe help put one little piece in a large picture.
And an important piece. As we bring this panel to a close, I'd like to point out something, and that is we entered the 19th century moving at 6 miles an hour, the speed of a horse-drawn vehicle. We entered the 20th century at 60 miles an hour, the speed of a steam locomotive. We entered the 21st at 600, the speed of a jet airliner. And if we do our job right, we'll enter the next century at 6,000, the speed of a routine hypersonic transportation system. We have muffed as a nation our opportunities to pursue hypersonics for far too many years, and this is not a smart thing to do. We need to press on in this area. These individuals gave us a database, and the engineering community gave us a database to exploit and make use of this, and it's there for us to do, and that should be one of our great challenges in this next century as we try to continue our aeronautical competitiveness. Thank you all very much, gentlemen, and our salute to you. Thanks a lot.